Here's a historical figure that we think you should know about. This is Rebecca Latimer Felton. She was the first woman in the United States Senate. Georgia's governor appointed her after the incumbent died. Ms. Felton served for one day, November 21st, 1922, almost 100 years ago. Her one Senate speech focused on the equality of the sexes. She was a suffragist, but she was definitely not an abolitionist. Rebecca Latimer Felton was the last known senator who owned enslaved people. And her racism ran deep, including calls for mass lynchings to protect white women from black men. Quote, "If it takes lynching to protect women's dearest possession from drunken, ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 a week," unquote. Senator Felton and her family held enslaved people for generations before the Civil War. How many more stories are there like hers? Members of Congress who profited from slavery. According to the Washington Post, more than 1,700 and counting. A new project is chronicling slaveholders in Congress. Today, the Post published its database, and now it wants your help to fill in the gaps. Joining us now is Washington Post reporter Julie Zosmer Weil. She's part of the team working on this project. Ms. Weil, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
This database is fascinating. The story is absolutely fascinating. First of all, how did it come about?
Thank you. The idea actually came about in the summer of 2020 when Washington, D.C. did something that a number of cities have done, came up with a list of public buildings like schools and parks that the leaders who wrote the list thought should be renamed because of what the people whose names were on those buildings had done. And I was trying to figure out who these people were and realized many of them were in Congress. I Googled members of Congress who were slave owners and was very surprised to find out that there was no list.
Yeah, having lived in D.C. near the Van Ness metro station, which is near where my old station was, WAMU, I did not learn until I read your piece that that station is named after a congressman from New York who owned slaves. So it's kind of amazing how deeply ingrained this is in so many parts of the district. Overall, though, are we talking about most members of Congress, a minority of members of Congress? Like, what's the proportion like of slaveholders to non-slave holders through history, at least as far as we know?
It's a great question. It really depends on what time period you're looking at. In the early years, when Congress was a brand new institution, more than half of all congressmen were slaveholders for the first 18 years or so. After that, the number goes down as the northern states stop sending so many slaveholders to Congress, but it continues for many decades longer. Even during the Civil War, when all of the southern congressmen secede, they're not in Congress anymore. At that point, fighting a war to end slavery, 20% of the congressmen in the U.S. Congress still are former or current enslavers.
How did you research this report? I believe you said that census records were a big part of it, but what else did you go on?
The census was by far the biggest part, but there were many other records. I looked at wills and tax records and plantation records, anything I could find, really. And there's still a lot that I haven't found. I was able to reach a conclusion about almost 5,000 congressmen, whether they were or were not slaveholders, but there are still over 600 who I'm looking for information on, and I'm hoping that people will be able to go to their local courthouse or historical society or maybe their own family genealogy and send me some of this information.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna ask our team to share out a link to the page where folks can send information. We'll share it out on social media. We are at NBC Now Tonight on all the major socials. I wonder what your perspective is on the value of this kind of information. There's been a lot of debate over the last year and a half over how we teach and talk about the legacy of slavery in America, whether it's the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1776 Commission, which the Trump administration created to create this kind of ahistorical history of the United States. How do you view the way that we teach and talk about slavery today, including things like this that we're still discovering?
I mean, as I was working on this project, I came across so many stories that felt incomplete. There were stories like Charles Minor, for example, who there are books about him that say he was one of the early and fiercest advocates for ending slavery in D.C. What it doesn't mention is that I found the 1810 census, and it says that Charles Minor was a slaveholder at that time. So what happened in between, I don't know, because that part of the story hasn't been told. These stories are not complete.
New Jersey Democratic Senator Cory Booker spoke to your team about this database on slavery, and he noted part of what you said, which is that all around that the Capitol is shaped by this legacy, as he put it, that we don't fully know or fully acknowledge. There is going to be a new statue in the National Statuary Hall very soon of Mary McLeod Bethune, replacing a Confederate general who had represented Florida, some guy who I think was not even from the state of Florida. Before I have to let you go, where do you see this effort to kind of re-understand history going beyond the Washington Post's database? Is this part of a larger push, or are these one of kind of the only efforts that's going on before we go?
I really hope that it is part of a larger conversation. I'm hoping that historians will be able to use this to, when they're doing their analysis of what laws these early lawmakers made, this data can be useful to look at who was voting and how were they voting. I hope that those cities that are talking about whose name should be on buildings will look at this data and use it as a resource, and the conversation will continue.
This is so fascinating. And again, we'll share out the link for people if they have information that might be useful to identify the other 600 some odd members of Congress who have yet to be attributed. Julie Zosmer-Weil of the Washington Post, we appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.